Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the most powerful warrior you can imagine. Maybe it is a space marine, one of those transhuman soldiers sculpted from the DNA of a demigod, wrapped in ceramite plating that can stop a tank round carrying weapons that could level a city block. 8 feet of genetically perfected killing instinct, a mind sharpened by decades of combat and indoctrination, able to survive poisons that would dissolve lesser men from the inside out, able to fight with broken limbs, to keep moving through wounds that would kill 10 ordinary men, to process a battlefield with a clarity and speed that makes mortal soldiers look like they are moving through deep water. A space marine is, by any reasonable assessment, a miracle of human engineering. It's just the culmination of one of the greatest scientific projects in the history of civilization. Something that should not be possible, and is, somehow, possible, and has been possible for 10,000 years. Now imagine that warrior looking up at what stands before them and feeling something unfamiliar flicker in the back of their enhanced mind. Not challenge, exactly. Not simple fear, which a space marine is conditioned against so thoroughly that it would take something truly extraordinary to produce it. Something more complex and more fundamental than either of those things. Something that might, if you pressed a space marine to name it, come out as awe. That is what it is to encounter an Adeptus Custodes in the sprawling, galaxy-spanning darkness of the 41st Millennium, as a place where horror and heroism are so thoroughly entangled that you cannot always tell which is which. The custodians occupy a category entirely their own. They are not generals, not soldiers in the conventional sense, not Templars or Inquisitors or any of the 100 other flavors of warrior that the Imperium of man has invented across its long and violent history to throw at a hostile universe. They are something older and more personal and more specific than any of those things. Something that exists at the intersection of myth and flesh in a way that 10,000 years of warfare have not managed to erode or dilute or reduce to something more convenient. They are the Emperor's own, not in the loose, devotional sense that every Imperial soldier and every Imperial citizen might claim that title. Not in the way a space marine is a son of a Primarch who is in turn a son of the Emperor, that chain of genetic legacy that runs through the entire structure of the Imperium's military like a river through stone. They are his, directly, uniquely, irreplaceably, the product of his own hands and his own genetic inheritance, and the full weight of a genius that has never had an adequate description, shaped with a precision and an investment of care that he lavished on nothing else in his long, impossibly long existence, stretching back across the entire pre-imperial age. Each one is a singular investment, each one a masterwork, each one carrying, somewhere in the blood and bone and enhanced flesh of their making, something of the master of mankind himself. Not a fraction or a dilution, but something genuine. Is something that burns in their eyes with a light that has no purely mechanical explanation, and that ordinary humans, when they find themselves in the proximity of it, tend to experience as the physical presence of something sacred. And they have been carrying that weight for a very, very long time. When we talk about the life of an Adeptus Custodes, we are not talking about the life of a warrior in any sense that a war correspondent or a historian of conventional military institutions would recognize. We are talking about an existence that stretches across centuries, that encompasses duties and psychological burdens, and a quality of awareness that no human vocabulary quite manages to capture. We are talking about beings who were created to be companions to a god, you who walked beside that god as he remade the stars and reached across the void to gather humanity's scattered children back into something that might, given enough time, become worthy of the name civilization. And we are talking about what happened to those beings when the god fell, and the centuries that followed, and what the 10,000 years between that falling and the present moment have done to beings who were not built to experience loss on that scale. The golden armor they wear is not merely armor. It is a statement about what they are and what they have lost and what they refuse to stop being. Each suit is worth more than entire planetary economies, wrought from a material called auramite that barely exists anywhere else in the known universe, machined to fit the exact dimensions of the warrior inside it and nobody else. Because no two custodians are shaped identically, because nothing about them is mass-produced, because they are not a production run, but a collection of individuals, each of whom represents an unrepeatable configuration of human potential. Every gem set into the surfaces of that armor was hand-mined from beneath the surface of Holy Terror itself, and hand-cut by artisans who likely spent their entire careers on nothing else. Because the Imperium has understood since its founding that the custodians deserve the absolute best of everything it can produce, and that shortcutting that standard is not something it is prepared to entertain. Every scroll of scripture etched into the greaves and vambraces records deeds done and oaths sworn, a running historical record of one warrior's service carried into every subsequent engagement, as accumulating across centuries until the text becomes so dense that new inscriptions must be worked in between older ones with instruments of almost impossible precision. It is, in a very real sense, a living monument worn by the person it commemorates, and the man or woman inside that monument, because the law is clear by the 41st millennium that both men and women can walk this path, though the records of the early eras are less clear on this, is something the universe has not quite found a way to categorize. They do not age in any biological sense that produces visible deterioration, which means that a warrior who walked the floors of the Imperial Palace during the Great Crusade 10,000 years ago may still be walking those same floors today, by carrying all of those years in the architecture of their memory and the specific gravity of their presence. They do not have a battle cry, and that deliberate silence says something profound about them. Where Space Marines charge with hymns on their lips and the names of their primarchs on their tongues, custodians simply advance. They do not need to announce what they are. The universe knows. What I want to do in this video is take you through everything that makes these warriors what they are, not just the statistics and the combat records, though we will cover those, but the deep lore, the psychology, the history, and the genuinely fascinating and sometimes genuinely heartbreaking narrative that runs through 10,000 years of their existence and has produced the Golden Warriors who are, right in the present moment of the 41st millennium, finally stepping back out into the galaxy and bringing something ancient and terrible to bear on enemies who have been getting comfortable, assuming they would never have to face this. We are going to go from the very beginning, from the age before the Imperium existed as anything other than the Emperor's ambition, through the glory of the Great Crusade, and the catastrophe of the Horus heresy, and the long, aching vigil that followed, and all the way to the current era where everything has changed and nothing has changed, and the Golden Warriors walk beneath alien suns for the first time in millennia. Settle in. This takes time to do properly, and these warriors deserve to be done properly. Or Section 2, Before the Beginning, Origins and the Emperor's First Creation. There is a fundamental problem with telling the origin story of the Adeptus Custodes, and that problem is both simple and maddeningly comprehensive. Nobody fully knows it, not the custodians themselves, or at least not completely. And this is not a failure of record keeping, it is a deliberate structural feature of how the Emperor organized his early work. Not the scholars and archivists and lore masters of the administratum, who have spent collective centuries trying to piece together the formative period of the Imperium from fragments and echoes and documents that are either incomplete, deliberately obscured behind layers of classification that have calcified into permanent institutional secrecy, and or simply buried under so many generations of reinterpretation that whatever original truth they once contained has been polished smooth by time and handling. The origins of the Custodian Guard are wrapped in the same deliberate mystery that the Emperor wrapped around everything he truly valued, which is to say, they are hidden behind layers of myth and legend that have, over the course of 10,000 years, hardened into something increasingly indistinguishable from fact. What we know, pieced together painstakingly from what evidence does survive across various sources, amounts to this. Long before the Great Crusade, long before the Primarchs were found adrift in the galaxy and brought back into the Imperial fold, long before the Thunder Warriors tore Terra apart in the Emperor's service, and those enormous and tragically unstable enhanced soldiers who cleared the path for the later Legiones Astartes, long before the Space Marine Legions were even a concept being tested in the secret underground laboratories, where the Emperor's biological sciences reached depths that modern understanding cannot fully map. There were the Custodians. The earliest reliable references to their existence appear in records from the Unification Wars, that vast, brutal, ultimately necessary campaign in which the Emperor emerged from the shadows of history, where he had been working for thousands of years, guiding, influencing, sometimes directly intervening in human affairs from a position of anonymity, and decided that anonymity was no longer adequate to the moment. The world that became the throne world was not always the seat of human power. As in during the Age of Strife, when warp storms had severed the links between the stars and left every world to face its nightmares alone, Terra had fractured into a collection of warring nations and city-states and techno-barbarian kingdoms, each clinging to whatever fragments of civilization they could preserve in the ruins of something that had once been genuinely great. Into this broken world, the Emperor came openly, at last, and even then, walking among human armies and mortal politics and the grinding, attritional reality of planetary unification, he was not alone. The records describe the Custodians in those early years simply as trusted bodyguards and advisors, and the deliberate sparseness of that language carries its own meaning. Someone was being thoughtful about what they committed to writing, just about how much of the truth should be preserved in a form that might eventually be read by eyes the Emperor had not anticipated. What cave etchings and stasis-locked fragments and gene-sealed tomes speak of is not ordinary guardians. They were something that had already crossed an irreversible threshold between enhanced human soldier and something that defied the categories available. Their first confirmed appearance in verifiable records comes during the fall of a techno-barbarian fortress called Nassasal, early in the Unification Wars, and even in that sparse account, the people present were clearly struggling to find language adequate to describing what they were witnessing. Here is the critical thing about when the Custodians were made, and the implications of that timing are staggering. They predate the Thunder Warriors, who preceded the Space Marines. They predate the processes that would eventually produce the Legiones Astartes. They predate, in many accounts, even the formal commencement of the Emperor's genetic engineering project that would produce the Primarchs, those 20 extraordinary beings who represent his most ambitious attempt at the engineered perfection of a human mind and body. If the Primarchs are the Emperor's beloved children, the Custodians were made before he thought of having children. They are the oldest model, the prototype for the entire tradition of enhanced human warriors, refined to a level that was never fully replicated, because the Emperor made a deliberate and considered choice never to try to replicate it. When he turned to creating the Primarchs and then the Space Marines, choice he built with different tools and toward different ends. The Legiones Astartes were an army. They were designed for quantity as well as quality, not mass-produced in a casual sense, because there was nothing casual about the making of a Space Marine, but designed around a template that could be reproduced, that could produce millions of warriors from a consistent process, that could sustain attrition and replace losses and continue functioning at scale. The Custodians were never that. They could not be that. What it took to make one of them was too specific, too individualized, too dependent on the direct application of knowledge and technique that existed nowhere else in the Imperium to be industrialized without losing the very quality that made them what they were. What the genetic material used to produce them is the subject of considerable ongoing debate. The most authoritative sources available, those which claim access to records sealed since the early Crusade, support the position that the template for the Custodians was drawn from the Emperor's own biological material, that they are, in the most literal sense that language can bear, made in his image. Not as genetic descendants in the way a child inherits from a parent, but as deliberate constructions using his DNA as the foundational document from which the enhancement process worked outward. This would explain several qualities about them that cannot be accounted for by mechanical enhancement alone. The supernatural aura that seems to surround them and deflect harm. There's the psychic resonance that other psychers describe as the experience of standing near something profoundly and distinctively sacred. The fierce, almost magnetic quality of their presence that seems to affect the emotional state of ordinary humans nearby in ways that go beyond what the physical impression of a large and powerful person could produce. Other scholars argue for a different source. Some lost genetic heritage from the dark age of technology, perhaps. Some accumulated lore collected across many human lifetimes of biological research that the Emperor assembled and synthesized in ways no one since has been able to fully reconstruct. The truth, if it can be found at all, is locked away in records that no living person can open, is sealed behind methods that the Emperor apparently designed specifically to resist the kind of casual investigation that 10,000 years of curiosity might otherwise have accomplished. What is not in dispute, because the result is visible and has been verified across multiple independent observations across many centuries, is what the process produces. A custodian standing next to a space marine is larger, not by a dramatic, immediately cartoonish margin, but perceptibly and unmistakably larger. A full head taller on average, broader across the chest and shoulders, with a physical density that even powerful armor cannot fully account for, a solidity that suggests the person inside has been remade so thoroughly that the standard vocabulary of human physical development no longer quite applies. Constantin Valdor, as the first Captain General, and by most informed assessments the most powerful individual custodian who ever lived, was recorded as being the same height as Alpharius of the Alpha Legion. Alpharius was the smallest of the Primarchs, a concession to the demands of his particular role as an infiltration specialist, and he was still so far beyond ordinary human scale as to occupy essentially a different physical category. Valdor matched him. The full custodian frame sits between the Astartes and the Primarchs on the scale of engineered human potential. And in a universe where that scale already stretches from the merely exceptional to the mythologically powerful, the ground between those points is vast and consequential, but sheer physical scale is the least interesting part of what the transformation produces. Yet the Emperor built into the custodians something. He did not build into the Space Marines to the same degree, because he did not need to build it into the Marines in the same way. A quality of mind. A capacity for philosophical reasoning, for the kind of multi-layered strategic thinking that can hold a dozen complex problems simultaneously without losing the thread of any of them, for the integration of tactical, political, social, and psychological considerations into a single coherent assessment of a situation that would take a committee of mortal specialists weeks to develop and might still miss something important. He built in adaptability, genuine adaptability, the ability to function as an individual rather than as a component of a larger system, to make judgment calls in the absence of any command structure or supporting framework, as to be genuinely useful as a lone operative in an environment where being a member of a coordinated squad would not help and might actively hinder. He built in a breadth of education that the Legiones Astartes, for all their excellence, were not designed to receive. He needed guards who could protect him from everything. Not just the physical threats that enhanced biology and advanced armor were adequate to address, but the political threats, the institutional erosions, the subtle long-game manipulations of enemies, sophisticated enough to understand that sometimes the most effective way to destroy something is to undermine the foundations it rests on before the structure itself shows any visible sign of damage. He needed warriors who could think like philosopher kings, fight like something that had been built exclusively for violence. Essen read the room of a gathering of imperial nobility with enough precision to identify, across the table, the person whose smile was exactly 2 degrees too wide and whose choice of words, reviewed in retrospect, revealed that they had known something they should not have known 3 days before anyone else in the room. He needed all of that. He built all of that. And the custodians have been all of that, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes at enormous cost, sometimes in ways that produced outcomes no simple taxonomy of virtues and capabilities could have predicted. For 10,000 years and counting, the early custodians drew their recruits from children of Terran nobility. Sons, in the early documented records, later expanded to include daughters as the lore accumulated across different eras, were from the aristocratic houses that had survived or emerged from the chaos of the Age of Strife. Families were approached, and children were presented before the Avenue of Sacrifice, outside the Ascensor's Gate of the Imperial Palace for assessment. The assessment was not a formal test in the way that Space Marine aspirant selection is a formal process with documented criteria and observable stages. It was something more intuitive than that. A custodian's enhanced senses applied to a gathered group of infants and children, reading qualities too subtle for any instrument to detect, identifying the specific combinations of potential that the transformation process could work with. Most of those presented were not selected. Of those selected, many did not survive the transformation. The practice continued anyway, because what the families were offering was understood on all sides to be an offering in the most genuine sense of that word, a giving without guarantee of return, an act of faith in the validity of the purpose to which the child was being given. The Terran nobility maintained waiting lists for this honor. They competed for it. They understood, at the level of cultural knowledge that persists across generations, even when the specific factual basis for it has been lost, that to produce a custodian was to produce something that would outlast every trace of the family that contributed to its creation. In many ways, they were right. Section 3. The making of a God's companion, recruitment and transformation. To understand what it means to become a custodian, you need to start with what it means to become a Space Marine, because the comparison is instructive in a specific way. A Space Marine aspirant is typically a young man, somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 years old, who has already demonstrated exceptional physical qualities and psychological resilience through whatever trials his culture of origin uses to identify such qualities. Combat sports, survival challenges, direct assessment by Marine recruiters who know what they are looking for. By the time he is presented for formal selection, he has already passed through at least one filter that removed all but the most capable candidates. He is, in other words, a proven, exceptional person being offered the chance to become something even more exceptional. The enhancement process that follows, while genuinely grueling and by no means certain to succeed even for those who enter it, he follows a sequence that has been refined and repeated so many times across so many generations that it has become, in a meaningful sense, a known process. The gene seed implants trigger specific biological transformations in a specific order. The body does the work of responding to the genetic triggers, while the seed guides the direction of the changes. Multiple organs are added, the skeleton reinforced, the musculature rebuilt, the neurological architecture accelerated. It takes years. It is not comfortable. Some aspirants do not make it through, but the broad outlines of what will happen are predictable, and the techniques for managing the process, for catching problems early and addressing them before they become fatal, have been developed and passed down and improved across a timeline measured in millennia. A custodian's creation is nothing like this. Where a Space Marine begins as a proven adolescent, a custodian begins as an infant, months old, or at most in late infancy, because the transformations required to produce a custodian are so profoundly restructuring that a body not at the very beginning of its developmental process cannot accommodate them without simply breaking apart under the incompatible demands being made on it. The organic systems need to be reshaped from something very close to their beginning, not redirected from a developmental path already substantially underway. The process itself is not standardized in any meaningful sense. Each candidate is approached individually, the specific enhancements calibrated to the specific person, should the genetic law applied in a configuration tailored to what that particular subject can become, rather than what the process applied uniformly tends to produce. The Emperor's original techniques are only partially understood by those who now maintain them. The broad strokes are reconstructed from records and the evidence of outcomes, but the specific knowledge of why certain choices produce certain results is more art than science, more accumulated empirical experience than theoretical model. This individualization is not a limitation of the process, it is the point of the process. The individuality it produces, the fact that every custodian is genuinely unique in a way that no Space Marine is quite unique, because every Space Marine shares broad biological and psychological architecture with his Legion or Chapter brothers, is not a side effect. It is the intended outcome. The Emperor needed warriors who were each a distinct person capable of original judgment. He built the process to produce that, and it does. What the transformation does to the body over the years it takes to complete is comprehensive in a way that makes even Space Marine enhancement look comparatively modest. The skeletal density achieves levels that make the bones themselves structurally protective, capable of absorbing significant impact before beginning to fail. The muscle system rebuilds according to an efficiency model that represents an entirely different category of biological engineering from anything produced by ordinary development. Just the cardiovascular architecture is redesigned. The neurological processing speed accelerates to a degree that makes a custodian's perception of time, under stress, meaningfully different from anything an unenhanced human or even an enhanced Space Marine experiences. A fraction of a second in their awareness contains enough processed information to allow responses that appear, to outside observers, to have preceded the stimulus that triggered them. The senses extend to ranges that strain ordinary description. A custodian can hear conversations happening in adjacent rooms through thick stone walls. They can track individual heartbeats in a crowd and read the variations in rhythm that signal stress, deception, preparation for violence. But their vision reaches into wavelengths beyond ordinary human range and processes movement with a clarity and speed that allows them to track multiple fast-moving targets simultaneously. The sense of smell is so refined that it can detect trace chemical signatures that no human-built instrument of comparable size could match, which means that what an ordinary person would describe as meeting someone and forming an impression is, for a custodian, a comprehensive forensic assessment that takes approximately 3 seconds and produces more information than an hour of careful interview might provide. And then there is the thing that cannot be fully explained mechanically, that quality of presence, that emanation that the lore describes in various ways as the spark of the Emperor's power, as a blessed field, and as something that sits between the physical and the psychic and cannot be comfortably reduced to either category. What it does practically is this: it turns the universe against attacks on the custodian, not reliably, not absolutely, but with a frequency and a consistency that cannot be dismissed as statistical noise. Bullets that should connect miss by inches. Blades that should bite fail to find purchase. Psychic powers that have shattered walls of ceramite seem to encounter a resistance that their casters cannot account for or predict. Space Marines sometimes attribute this to luck, and the custodians tend not to correct them because the attribution does not matter. The effect is real. The psychological transformation is as comprehensive as the physical one, and in some ways more interesting. But the conditioning that produces a Space Marine's psychology is well documented at a high level. The cult indoctrination, the deliberate suppression of certain emotional responses, the amplification of loyalty and aggression, and the capacity for sustained violence, the embedding of doctrinal belief that gives purpose and framework to what would otherwise be a life of constant horror. It produces warriors of extraordinary dedication and capability, but the process is intentionally constraining. The indoctrination removes certain human qualities because those qualities are not necessary for the role, and removing them makes the product more reliable. Custodian psychological conditioning points in almost exactly the opposite direction. Where Space Marine training constrains and channels, custodian development opens and expands. And the philosophical education that is woven through their entire developmental period is not a supplement to their warrior training. It is co-equal with it, present at every stage, because the Emperor understood that the most dangerous threats to himself and to the project he was building were not things that could be addressed through violence alone. They required understanding. They required the ability to see systems from the inside and the outside simultaneously, to hold in mind the full complexity of a political or social situation without simplifying it into something manageable and thereby losing the truth of it. Every custodian, as part of their development, studies history, the history of terror before the Imperium, the mythologies and legal traditions and political structures of the dozens of nations the unification wars brought under imperial rule, the precedents and patterns that repeat across human civilization in different costumes. They study philosophy in the formal sense, the traditions of argumentation and inquiry and ethical reasoning that humanity developed across its long pre-imperial history. They study the art of governance, which includes the art of knowing when governance is failing and what that failure looks like in its early stages before it becomes visible to those it will eventually destroy. They study assassination. This one bears dwelling on. A custodian's training in the arts of killing is not limited to direct combat. They learn every documented method of covert killing, as every known technique of infiltration and poisoning and strategic murder, because a guardian who does not understand how the thing they are guarding might be killed cannot reliably prevent that death. The blood games, which we will come back to in detail, are the formal institutional expression of this principle, but it begins in the training itself. A custodian needs to be able to think like a killer who wants to reach the Emperor, because in order to prevent that killing, they have to be able to see the palace and the Emperor's life, and the 10,000 possible threat vectors surrounding both from the perspective of someone who has decided that today is the day. Because when the training ends, when the transformation is complete, and the conditioning is as fully embedded as it can to be, and the candidate has proven themselves through whatever final assessment the order applies, the new custodian takes their name, not the name given at birth, which has been left behind along with everything else that belonged to the child who entered the process, a name drawn from the mythology and history of terror, chosen to reflect something about who this person has become, or who they are becoming, or who they need to be. The choosing is taken seriously because in the culture of the custodians, names are not identifiers. They are histories. They are accumulations of meaning that grow with the warrior, each new deed adding to the name's resonance, each oath sworn adding to its weight. Constantine Valdor was, by the time the Horus Heresy began, had accumulated 1,932 such names. By the 41st millennium, the record of his full name was said to fill an entire volume. That is a life. Section 4. The living weapons, arsenal and armor. There is a moment, described in historical accounts across different periods, and by observers who are very different kinds of people. Scholars, soldiers, diplomats, ordinary citizens of terror, who happen to be standing near the right corridor at the right moment, in which someone encounters a custodian for the first time and is simply stopped in their tracks. Not by fear, though fear is present, a visceral or instinctive response to the proximity of something that the animal brain correctly identifies as being capable of killing you before you could complete a coherent thought. Not just by the physical scale, which is significant but not unique in a universe that contains space marines and Ogrin, and a dozen other categories of physically formidable being, by beauty, because what a custodian represents, in their armor and weapons and bearing, is the absolute pinnacle of what human craft and human resources and human devotion can produce when directed by a will and a vision that has never had its equal. Every element of what they carry into battle has been made by people, by individual human beings with individual skills and individual hours invested, who understood that they were not making equipment, they were making artifacts. Sacred objects in a tradition that existed before the Imperium had a name. Begin with the armor, because in some ways the armor is the most immediate and comprehensive expression of what the custodians are. Custodian armor is not power armor in the familiar ceramite and servo sense. Though it operates on broadly similar mechanical principles, the material from which it is made is called auramite, and it is extraordinary in several distinct ways that ceramite is not. Its natural color is a deep, resonant gold. Not painted gold, not coated gold, but gold at the level of the material's fundamental structure, which means that it does not chip or peel or fade in the way a surface treatment would, but persists for as long as the armor itself persists, which is effectively indefinitely given appropriate maintenance. As the auramite is harder than ceramite, and more resistant to the specific kinds of damage that warfare produces, it is also, fascinatingly, almost completely inert at the quantum level in a way that makes it significantly less of an impediment to psychic energy than ceramite, a quality that the Emperor's own auramite battleplate was said to take advantage of during the final confrontation at the Siege of Terra, when his psychic combat required armor that would not interfere with the energies he needed to direct. Each suit is made to the exact measurements of the custodian who will wear it, not approximately, not using a sizing system with preset categories. Exactly. The dimensions are taken, and the suit is produced to those dimensions, and the person who commissioned it wears it, and nobody else does. This means that each suit is, just in the practical sense, a unique object that can never be transferred to a different wearer without the kind of fundamental reconstruction that would amount to producing a new suit from scratch. When a custodian falls in battle, their armor is not reallocated. It goes to the Hall of Names. The fit that this process produces is not merely ceremonial. A suit of armor that fits its wearer exactly, rather than approximately, moves with the body, rather than creating friction and resistance against it. The articulation of a custodian in their plate is not the cautious, constrained movement of a warrior working around the limitations of what they are wearing. It is the full, unconstrained movement of a fighter whose armor is, in a meaningful sense, part of them. As the servos and actuators that assist movement in the heavy plate do not have to work against the suit's geometry to do their work. This produces a range and speed of movement that most observers, seeing it for the first time, simply do not expect from something that visually reads as a tank with a personality. The gems, set into the armor's surfaces, across the pauldrons and chestplate and vambraces and helm, arranged according to patterns that have been consistent within the tradition for millennia, are individually mined from deep beneath the surface of Terra and hand-cut by artisans who will probably do nothing else with their professional lives. The color of those gems indicates shield company and shield host allegiances, carries specific meanings within the internal culture of the custodians, and forms a visual language that allows any warrior of the order to read exactly who they are looking at and what that warrior's status and history are before a word has been spoken. When a custodian changes allegiance between formations, the gems are extracted and replaced with those appropriate to the new affiliation. This process is performed with instruments of extraordinary precision, because damaging the surrounding auramite in the process would require repairs that create discontinuities in the surface, and a suit of custodian armor is expected to carry its history in a smooth and legible form for the entire length of its existence. The refraction field generators and proximity sensor arrays built into each suit add a layer of protection that borders, in its practical effect, on precognitive. And the suit's systems can identify an incoming attack from its trajectory and velocity before the custodian wearing it has consciously processed the sensory information that would trigger a manual response, and it reacts accordingly, subtly shifting the wearer's posture, adjusting the field geometry to present the optimal surface to the threat, in ways that feel, to an experienced custodian, like a kind of unconscious foreknowledge, a sense that their body already knows what is happening a fraction of a second before their mind catches up with it. The whole ensemble, full custodian armor, all components integrated, gems placed, inscriptions current, is worth more than most planetary economies. This is not hyperbole for dramatic effect, and this is a statement that people familiar with the logistics of the Imperium accept as an accurate summary of the material and labor costs involved. The Imperium has never flinched at this expense. It has never will flinch at this expense, because certain things are simply necessary.
Honestly, the more I sat with the Custodes lore while putting this together, the more it hit me in ways I didn't expect. Like, we spent a lot of time in this hobby talking about who would win in a fight, or which faction has the coolest aesthetic, and those conversations are fun. But the Custodes stopped feeling like a tabletop faction to me somewhere around the third hour of research. They started feeling like a meditation on grief, on what you do when the thing that gave your life meaning is gone, and you still have to get up in the morning and do the work. I don't know, maybe that's just me, maybe I got too deep into it, but I think that's actually the highest compliment I can pay any piece of fiction, that it found a way to make you feel something real, and the Custodes did that for me. But anyway, let's go back to the video.
And the question of what they cost is not relevant to whether they must be done. Now the weapons. The Guardian's spear is the icon of the Custodians in the way that the bolter is the icon of the Space Marines. But this comparison, while useful as a starting point, rather undersells what the Guardian's spear actually is. The bolter is a superlative combat weapon whose fundamental design has been reproduced in essentially identical form hundreds of millions of times across 10,000 years, or because it is excellent and reliable, and the qualities that make it excellent and reliable are compatible with large-scale manufacturing. The Guardian's spear is none of those things, or rather, it is excellent and reliable, but those qualities are achieved through means that are categorically incompatible with large-scale manufacturing. Each Guardian's spear is a halberd-like power weapon, roughly the height of the custodian carrying it, which makes it a weapon that several ordinary humans could not meaningfully lift, with a power-filled blade capable of cutting through any material an enemy might reasonably be wearing, and an integrated bolter weapon built into the shaft that allows ranged fire to be laid down without requiring the custodian to abandon their close combat stance. Whilst the combination is designed to serve bodyguards specifically, people who may need to clear a path at range, and then close to melee, and then open distance again, and then close again, in sequences that happen faster than a conventional weapon swap allows. The transition between ranged fire and close combat is not a mode switch requiring mechanical adjustment. It is a change in how the weapon is held and deployed, which takes approximately as long as it takes a custodian to decide to do it. The weapons are so heavy, by ordinary human standards, that the physical fact of a custodian spinning one in sweeping arcs with the speed and precision that observers consistently record says more about what lives inside the golden armor than any description of enhanced musculature could. These are not slow, the powerful movements that land with crushing force. They are fast, precise movements that happen to carry crushing force as a secondary property. There are variations within the spear tradition. The Adrasite spear incorporates an Adrathic destructor rather than a conventional bolter, a weapon that disintegrates matter by disrupting the molecular bonds that hold it together, which means it is not constrained by the armor penetration math that governs conventional kinetic or plasma weapons. Armor does not stop it because it does not hit the armor, it simply causes the armor to stop existing. The Pyrothite spear incorporates a compact melter weapon for situations where massive heat, rather than molecular disruption, is the appropriate response. The Paragon spear, carried only by the most decorated shield captains and tribunes, yet is a masterwork that incorporates a Paragon bolter, an advanced ranged weapon of archaeotech provenance that produces effects at range that standard bolters cannot match. For custodians who prefer a different combat philosophy, the Sentinel blade offers a different kind of versatility. It is a powered broadsword of such substantial size that its hilt is flanked by the double barrels of a bolt caster, which is a short-range rapid-fire weapon capable of laying down a hail of fire that discourages attempts to maintain distance. And it is designed to be wielded one-handed, which is a statement about physical capability that needs no further emphasis. Paired with a storm shield, whose built-in energy generator deflects attacks that would destroy lighter defenses, which this combination allows a custodian to function as a walking fortification, absorbing and deflecting tremendous incoming force, while systematically disassembling anything that comes within the blade's considerable reach. The Castellan axe, favoured by the custodian wardens, represents yet another philosophical approach to the same basic problem. It is a momentum weapon designed to be used in sweeping combinations that redirect its mass at changing angles, with a suddenness that opponents consistently fail to anticipate even when they know it is coming. Each warden who accepts the axe spends a full Terran year in meditation before taking it, composing the personal oaths that will bind them to its specific combat philosophy. The weapon is not issued, it is accepted after serious and sustained reflection. Thus, the Alaris Terminators operate at a level above all of this. Their armour, Alaris Terminator plate, driven by magnetomic generator shrines, and articulated with Leonis-class actuators, built from layered auramite and adamantium in a combination that the lore describes as capable of sustaining a macro-cannon shell impact and allowing the wearer to continue advancing, is the single most effective man-portable combat armour that exists in the Imperium as of the 41st Millennium. The weapons these warriors carry match the armour: Guardian spears, twice the height of a standing person; Castellan axes, scaled up to match the Terminator frame's enhanced strength; ballistus grenade launchers on the forearms for area denial work at medium range. The vehicles the Custodians operate are as individualized and as extraordinary as the armour. The grav tanks, the Caladius, the Pallas, the Coronis grav carrier, incorporate anti-gravity technology sourced from the Dark Age of technology, maintained by Custodian adherents, who guard the operating knowledge as carefully as they guard everything else they consider part of their institutional inheritance. The Caladius mounts twin Lastris accelerator cannons as its primary armament, weapons that the Mechanicus has formally and repeatedly requested access to across multiple different millennia and been refused each time. The Coronis grav carrier provides the rapid deployment capability that the Custodian's doctrine requires, the ability to place extraordinarily powerful warriors exactly where they need to be, faster than the enemy can respond. The forbidden weapons in the Custodian arsenal, the Adrathic weapons, the Lastrum systems, was the Archaeotech armaments whose operating principles the Mechanicus does not fully understand and cannot independently replicate, are a source of ongoing tension between the Custodians and the Adeptus Mechanicus that has been ongoing, at varying levels of intensity, for 10,000 years. The Custodians hold these weapons not out of institutional jealousy or a desire to maintain a monopoly for its own sake. They hold them because they were the Emperor's weapons before they were the Custodians' weapons, and because the knowledge of how to use them belongs, in a very real sense, to the tradition the Emperor created. The Mechanicus has other weapons. The Custodians have these ones, and they will keep them. Everything they carry is a statement, layered on the statement of their physical presence, layered on the statement of their armour, and layered on the statement of what they are and have been and will continue to be. The armour says, "Nothing that walks this universe can break me." The weapons say, "And anything that tries will not survive the attempt." The inscriptions say, and I have already proven this, more times than you can count. Section 5. The Art of Killing Gods, Combat Philosophy and the Blood Games. There is an exercise the Custodians conduct that has no precise parallel anywhere else in the Imperium's military tradition. It is called the Blood Games, and it is one of the most psychologically sophisticated and practically important practices in the entire history of the Order. The premise is this: a Custodian, or sometimes a small group of Custodians, strips away every marker of their identity. The armour comes off. The weapons are left behind, in or replaced with whatever improvised tools might plausibly be available to a person trying to move through the underworld of terror without official sanction. Everything about their appearance that would identify them as a warrior of the Emperor's Guard is removed or disguised. Then they enter the broader society of terror, the teeming hive city that surrounds and underlies, and in some ways subsumes the Imperial Palace, as an ordinary person. Their objective is to reach the Emperor's throne room, not by force, not by announcing themselves and demanding passage, not by any means that depends on what they actually are. by whatever combination of infiltration and deception and social manipulation and sheer audacity they can bring to bear. Navigating through layer after layer of security they themselves help design and help maintain, until they either reach their objective or are stopped. If they succeed, every layer of security they pass through is examined and strengthened. The methods they use to bypass each checkpoint are analysed and countered. Every technique that worked is, by definition, a vulnerability that must be addressed. The blood game has revealed what could not be seen from inside the system. If they fail, if they are caught and identified and stopped before reaching their objective, that result is equally valuable. What held? What proved robust enough that a custodian with full working knowledge of the palace's defensive architecture could not find a way through it? The failures are studied as carefully as the successes, because they tell you something that success cannot, where the strength actually lies, as which elements of the defense are doing real work versus which elements only appear to be doing real work. The exercise is, first and most obviously, an extraordinary security tool. The palace that the custodians guard is not a static defensive structure. It is an organism, a living system of protocols and physical barriers and human personnel and psychic wards and technological systems that must constantly adapt to new threats and new information. And the blood games are the mechanism by which the system tests itself against the most sophisticated possible challenger. No external penetration test could be more thorough. The people running it know every secret the building has, because they are its keepers. And if they cannot find a way through, nothing outside the tradition has a realistic chance of finding one either. But the blood games are more than a security exercise. They are a form of psychological maintenance that addresses a challenge unique to the custodian's position. Consider what is required. A custodian participating in a blood game must, for the duration of that game, which can last months and has on documented occasions lasted years, think like an assassin. Not an assassin in the abstract sense of someone whose profession requires the occasional use of lethal force, but an assassin specifically targeting the emperor. They must inhabit, as completely as possible, the mindset of someone who has decided that killing or accessing the most protected person in the history of human civilization is an achievable objective, and who is prepared to devote whatever time and ingenuity is required to achieving it. As this is psychologically demanding in ways that are easy to understate, the entire structure of a custodian's identity is organized around their role as protector, their oaths, their conditioning, the deepest architecture of their psychological development. Everything about them runs toward protecting the emperor and everything that the emperor represents. To participate in a blood game is to spend an extended period deliberately inverting that structure, thinking in the opposite direction, cultivating the enemy's perspective from the inside. It requires a flexibility of self that most warrior traditions would not even attempt to develop, because most warrior traditions understand that this kind of inversion carries risks. The custodians cultivate it anyway, because the risk of not doing so is worse. Whilst the original inspiration for the blood games is attributed by some sources to Constantine Valdor himself, who recommended after an early incident during the unification period that the custodian guard hold internal war games to prevent complacency. There is a harder to verify account that suggests Alfarius of the Alpha Legion, the Primarch whose entire strategic identity was organized around deception and whose legion's defining characteristic was the ability to be anyone at any time, actually infiltrated the Imperial Palace at some point during the early Great Crusade. The account states that he slew a custodian, assumed that custodian's identity, moved through the palace's inner defenses, and theoretically gained access to a defense turret that could have destroyed the Emperor's shuttle. Versus whether or not this specific incident happened exactly as described, and the involvement of Alfarius in any story should be weighted with appropriate skepticism, given that the Alpha Legion's particular form of mythos building makes their own accounts of their capabilities inherently unreliable. The point it makes is valid, and Valdor's response to it was entirely in character for a being of his capability and foresight. Between the Horus Heresy and the Indomitus Crusade, When most custodians never left the palace and were therefore unable to test themselves against the real threats that existed in the wider galaxy, the Order developed an alternative, a specialized corps whose purpose was to travel that wider galaxy and return with suitable subjects. These subjects included, on documented occasions, Chaos Space Marines captured in distant operations, active traitors, warriors of full Astartes enhancement and significant combat experience who had been fighting in the service of the ruinous powers for decades or longer. These individuals were transported back to Terra, placed inside the palace complex, and released, not in a controlled environment with safety nets and abort conditions. Released, with whatever they had, against the custodians who were now tasked with finding and dealing with them before they found something important. The willingness to accept this risk, to bring the most dangerous non-custodian warriors in human space into the heart of the Imperium's most sacred location as a deliberate training exercise, says everything about how seriously the Order took the maintenance of their readiness. If the standard could not be allowed to drop, the cost of allowing it to drop was the Emperor's life, which was and remains the only cost that matters. The combat philosophy the Blood Games develop and maintain is fundamentally different from anything else operating in the Imperium, and understanding it explains why encounters between custodians and other Imperial forces on joint operations can be complicated. The custodians do not fight as a unit. They fight as individuals who happen to be in the same location. Each warrior brings their own weapons preference, their own tactical assessment, their own determination of the optimal response to whatever the situation presents. There is no standardized doctrine beyond the objective: protect the Emperor, eliminate the threat, accomplish the mission, and the specific methods for achieving that objective are left entirely to the individual warrior's discretion. The coordination between custodians in a battle exists not because a command structure directs it, but because each warrior is making real-time assessments that include the positions and actions of their colleagues, and the collective result of many very capable individuals making very good decisions simultaneously in the same space tends to look like coordination even when it has not been explicitly planned. This appears, from outside, to be chaos. It is not chaos. It is a form of tactical flexibility that creates problems for enemies that coordinated doctrine does not. So an opposing force that has studied custodian combat records will see 10 different warriors addressing the same type of tactical situation in 10 meaningfully different ways, and trying to prepare countermeasures for all of them simultaneously without the ability to predict which approach a specific custodian will favor is, practically speaking, impossible. The Legiones Astartes built their fearsome combat effectiveness partly on the consistency of their doctrine, the ability to execute complex collective maneuvers under extreme pressure because the training had made those maneuvers instinctive. The custodians are powerful in part because they have deliberately avoided that kind of consistency, because they understood early that for the specific missions they were performing, predictability was a vulnerability rather than a strength. What makes this possible is the baseline. The physical and perceptual capabilities of a fully developed custodian are so far above any opponent they are likely to encounter that the specifics of how they choose to engage rarely determine the outcome of an individual engagement. A single custodian can hold ground against numbers that would require an entire Space Marine squad to contain. Their reaction speed is faster, their strength is greater, their armor is better, their weapons are more destructive, their situational awareness is more comprehensive. The biological deflection surrounding them borders on the supernatural, and layered over all of this is a mind that has spent decades or centuries processing every tactical scenario, every weapon system, every combat discipline, and every political and social context that might shape a security situation. In close quarters combat, the Guardian's spear becomes something that observers consistently struggle to describe adequately. It spins and sweeps and thrusts and transitions to ranged fire and back again in sequences that contain no wasted motion, because the person wielding it has practiced those sequences until they have become autonomous, not thought through but inhabited, not performed but expressed. The power field that surrounds the blade and the bolter ammunition that the shaft fires are devastating individually. Together, in the hands of a warrior who can direct them in continuous flowing combinations, they clear space and establish dominance over it in ways that reduce even formidable opponents to tactical problems rather than genuine threats. So this is the art that the Blood Games maintain, not just the physical proficiency that would be maintained by any sufficiently demanding training regimen, but the psychological acuity that makes the physical proficiency genuinely useful. The capacity to read a situation before it becomes a crisis, to identify the threat among the 1,000 possibilities, to move with purpose through a complex and dangerous environment without triggering the very responses one is trying to prevent. The art of being, in any room and any context, the most dangerous person present without announcing it, without, ideally, being detected at all. Because the best security does not look like security, and the best guardians look to the people who don't need to be afraid of them, like nothing at all. Section 6. The Great Crusade. Walking beside a living God. The Great Crusade represents something specific and unrepeatable in the Custodians' history. It is the period in which they existed as their fullest selves, not because the centuries that followed were characterized by failure or diminishment, though they were, in ways we will come to, but because the Crusade was the moment for which they had been made, the context in which every aspect of their design expressed itself in the way it was intended to. The Emperor walked among humanity. He led his armies in person. He stood at the front of the greatest military campaign in the history of the species, personally directing the reunification of a humanity that had been broken apart and scattered and in many cases half destroyed by 200 years of isolation and terror. What he was visible, present, engaged. Not a distant figure on a throne, but a physical force moving through the material world. His presence on a battlefield changing the nature of what a battle was in ways that no amount of historical reconstruction has ever quite managed to convey to people who were not there for it. And at his side, every single day, were the Custodians. Imagine what that was, not as an intellectual exercise about hierarchy and proximity, but as a lived reality for the warriors who were there. They had been made to be in the Emperor's presence. That was their design purpose, the goal toward which every aspect of their extraordinary development had been directed. And now they were there, day after day, campaign after campaign, across the 2 centuries that the Crusade lasted, walking beside a being who was, what in the most literal sense, everything their existence was organized around. Not worshipping him in the imperial cult sense, which would have been antithetical to the Emperor's explicit atheism, but accompanying him in the way that the word companion carries its most complete meaning, as the people who were present, who shared the experience, who were there. This is the image that history has preserved most vividly. Golden warriors striding through alien environments at the Emperor's shoulder, their auramite armor reflecting the light of suns that human eyes had not seen before the Crusade opened that particular system. Guardian spears carried at rest in a world where rest might need to become readiness in the span of a single heartbeat. Eyes that track everything in a room the moment they enter it, to cataloguing threats and non-threats and the gradations between them with a speed that ordinary observation cannot follow. But the Crusade was not only that image. The reality was more complex and more interesting. The Custodians during this period served in multiple roles simultaneously. The obvious one, physical protection of the Emperor, was primary but not exclusive. They also served as envoys, dispatched to newly compliant worlds to represent the Emperor's authority directly and to assess whether the compliance was genuine or strategic, whether the planetary governments the Crusade had installed were actually committed to the Imperial project, or were simply calculating that cooperation offered the best short-term survival odds. This was intelligence work as much as diplomacy, and it required the full range of the philosophical and social perceptiveness that Custodian training had developed. They served as the Emperor's private counsel in a way that no Primarch, for all their power and closeness to their creator, could quite match. The Primarchs were his sons, beloved, extraordinary, central to everything he was building. But their relationship with him was complicated by the specific dynamics of parental love and filial ambition, and the complex psychology of beings made to be superhuman in both physical and intellectual terms, who were also definitionally subordinate to a being they could not exceed. The custodians' relationship with the emperor had none of that complexity. They were not his heirs. They were not competing with each other or with him for any form of recognition or inheritance. They existed to serve him, and because that existence was complete, because there was nothing else they wanted that he had not given them, the counsel they offered was as close to unconditional honesty as any advisor to a supremely powerful individual has ever been capable of providing. Constantin Valdor stands as the fullest expression of this during the Crusade. He was, by all accounts, not merely an extraordinary warrior, though he was extraordinary in ways that even Primarchs acknowledged, in a universe where acknowledgement from a Primarch is not given casually. He was the Emperor's most trusted military intelligence, the person whose assessment of a situation the Master of Mankind weighed most heavily when deciding how to respond to it. With the quality of that assessment is attested by the fact that it was consistently correct across a campaign that lasted 2 centuries and covered thousands of worlds. Valdor's relationship with the Primarchs was careful and sometimes tense, and this is worth dwelling on because it illuminates something important about the Custodians' position in the imperial hierarchy. The Primarchs were the Emperor's sons, and the Custodians were his personal guard, and the Primarchs had every rational reason to understand and respect that distinction. Most of them did, in a formal sense. But the Custodians' refusal to integrate into the Primarchs' command structures, their insistence on answering only to the Emperor himself, or their habit of appearing in sensitive situations and conducting their own assessments independent of whatever the local legion commander had concluded, these things created friction. Valdor was once in open disagreement with Rogel Dawn about whether to pursue a covert assassination attempt against Horus after his corruption was confirmed. Dawn argued that moral constraints should govern how the Imperium fought its wars. Valdor argued that to not match the enemy's willingness to use any means necessary was to lose. The Emperor, in the end, closed the argument by declaring there would be no more shadows, no more veiled actions. But the argument itself, 2 beings of extraordinary capability and intelligence genuinely and vigorously disagreeing about an important question, and neither one simply deferring to the other's authority, illustrates what the Custodians were like during this period. They were not courtiers. They were not simply an honor guard that deferred to whoever ranked above them except for the Emperor. They were counsel, and real counsel sometimes argues. The Great Crusade's relationship with the Custodians also had a physical geography. They were present on Terra and present wherever the Emperor went, but they were rarely scattered widely across the campaign front. Individual Custodians on envoy missions would travel alone to distant worlds. Small groups accompanied the Emperor on specific campaigns, but the core of the 10,000 remained concentrated because that was where the Emperor was, and where the Emperor was where they needed to be. As the Battle of Gyros Thravian, fought against the Orc warlord Garkul Blackfang, described as one of the most powerful Orc leaders the Crusade ever encountered, the kind of being whose physical presence on a battlefield changes what the battlefield is, saw Custodians fighting alongside Space Marine legions in direct combat against a force that required everything the Imperium could bring to bear. This was rare. The Custodians were not a frontline combat force in the normal Crusade sense, but when the situation required them, they were there, and their effectiveness in those engagements was documented in terms that give you a sense of what the Imperium's enemies faced when the Golden Warriors entered the line. Before reaching the raising of Prospero, as it is worth pausing on the nature of what the Great Crusade itself represented to the Custodians as participants rather than as guardians. For the Space Marine legions, the Crusade was the defining event of their existence, the thing they were made for, the continuous expression of their purpose in the most direct and uncomplicated form available. They were conquering soldiers, and the crusade gave them worlds to conquer. The rhythm of the campaign, preparation, advance, contact, victory, consolidation, advance again, matched perfectly with the rhythm of what they were designed to do. The Custodians were more complex. They were simultaneously the most capable combatants in the Emperor's armies and the warriors who were most deliberately kept out of the front lines of the campaign. Also because the Emperor's safety could not be staked on the premise that they would always return from a given engagement without casualty. This created a specific tension, warriors of extraordinary capability, observing a campaign in which that capability could theoretically be decisive in a dozen different engagements, held back from most of those engagements because their primary function was not to be decisive, but to be present. The frustration this could have created was largely avoided by the quality of what they were held back for. The Emperor's direct attention was a gift that the Primarchs themselves competed for, and the Custodians were in constant proximity to it. The conversations that happened during the quiet hours between campaigns. So during the long transit stretches when the fleet moved between stars, and the Emperor's attention was focused on planning and analysis and the ongoing management of an empire being built in real time. Those conversations were the specific form of access that the Custodians had been made to value, and they had it continuously. This produced, over the 2 centuries of the Crusade, a relationship between the Custodians and the Emperor that was unlike anything else in the imperial hierarchy. Not the love between parent and child that characterized his relationships with the Primarchs. Not the devotion between commander and soldier that characterized his relationship with the Legion forces. Yes, something quieter and more consistent, and in some ways more honest. The relationship between a person who has no reason to be anything other than completely truthful, and the people who have been built specifically to receive and process complete truth without flinching from it. The Emperor told the Custodians things he did not tell his sons, not because he loved the Custodians more. The Primarchs were his children in a genuine sense, and he loved them in that genuine sense. But because the Custodians' relationship with him was simpler, less freighted with the complicated dynamics of legacy and expectation, and the specific wounds that fathers and children inflict on each other across the full span of a relationship. The Custodians were companions. They were there for the working out of thoughts in real time, but for the kind of thinking aloud that is only possible in the presence of people who have no personal stake in the conclusions, except for whether those conclusions are correct. The raising of Prospero is the Crusade-era event that most clearly shows what the Custodians were, and what they were prepared to do in service of the Emperor's will, even when that will pointed in directions that would create lasting damage. Valdor led a censure host to Prospero with orders to bring Magnus the Red back to Terra to face judgment for breaking the prohibition on sorcery established at the Council of Nicaea. The mission was, in its original design, an arrest, not an annihilation, an arrest, followed by a trial, followed by whatever outcome the Emperor had determined in advance was appropriate. What happened instead was that Horus, and already committed to his betrayal and moving pieces into position, manipulated the communications and the dynamics of the situation, such that Leman Russ, who accompanied Valdor with the Space Wolves, interpreted his orders as calling for destruction rather than detention. Valdor resisted. He tried to hold to the original mission parameters. He was overruled by events, by the revelation of genuine corruption among Magnus's sorcerers, by the practical impossibility of completing an arrest mission when the situation had already degraded to open combat, by the constraints of operating in the field without direct communication to the Emperor, who was already sitting upon the Golden Throne, managing the early crisis of Magnus's psychic breach. So the Custodians fought, and they won, in the tactical sense, alongside the Space Wolves. That is against a legion of psychers who were throwing everything they had at the attackers. And then they returned to Terra with the victory on record and the knowledge that something had gone wrong, that the mission had become something other than what it was supposed to be, and that the consequences of that transformation would be significant. The Crusade was ending. Not immediately, not overnight, but the forces that would tear it apart were already in motion, and the custodians, perhaps uniquely, could see them coming. They had been made to see them coming, and they could not stop them. Section 7. Fire and Ruin, the Horus Heresy and the Webway War. Here is the thing about the Horus Heresy that the histories tend to focus on: the battles, the Siege of Terror, the last stand before the Eternity Gate. So the final confrontation in the Vengeful Spirit, where the Emperor and Horus met for the last time. These are spectacular events, and they deserve the attention they receive. But the most important thing the Custodians did during the Horus Heresy, the thing that cost them the most, that broke their numbers down to a fraction of what they had been, that permanently changed the character of the Order, happened not on Terra's surface, not in any battle that appears prominently in the standard histories. It happened underground, in the dark, in a trans-dimensional battleground beneath the Imperial Palace that most of the Imperium, even now, does not know existed. The Emperor had been building something in secret for years before the heresy began. An extension of the Aeldari Webway, the complex trans-dimensional tunnel network that the Elder had used for interstellar travel for tens of thousands of years before humanity even existed, and which they had largely retreated from in the aftermath of their own catastrophe, that would allow humans to travel safely between the stars without the risks inherent in direct warp transit. No navigator mutations, no chaos exposure, no Geller field failures in the dead of space. The project, if successful, would have removed the warp as an existential choke point on human civilization and changed everything that followed from there, in ways impossible to fully calculate. The Emperor kept it secret because he understood that his enemies, the Chaos Gods, who had been working against him for longer than the Imperium had existed, would move to destroy it the moment they understood what it was, and they would have. So, he worked in secret, in the deepest subterranean vaults of the palace, and the project remained unknown until Magnus the Red, in an act of catastrophic good intention, sent a psychic warning about Horus's corruption via a method that the Emperor had explicitly forbidden, and which, in the process of arriving, shattered the psychic shielding surrounding the Webway project and tore open a gateway to the warp inside the Imperial Palace. The Emperor had no choice. He had to take his seat upon the Golden Throne, the device he had built to maintain the Webway portal, and he had to stay there, or the breach would consume everything. Which meant he could not lead the defense of the Imperium, which meant he could not deal personally with Horus or direct the war, which meant he was, for the first time in living memory, effectively immobilized while the galaxy burned around him. Into the breach, he sent the Custodians and the Sisters of Silence. What the Custodians found when they entered the Webway was a battlefield unlike anything the normal vocabulary of warfare can adequately describe. They were fighting in tunnels that ran through the space between reality and the warp, not fully in either, not governed by the physics of either, surrounded by an environment that actively resisted the imposition of order or stability or anything that a conscious mind could use as a fixed reference point. And the enemies they were fighting were demons, entities that existed as expressions of the Chaos God's will given temporary physical form, that could not be killed in any conventional sense, because death meant something different to them than it did to biological organisms, that attack not only with physical force, but with the specific psychic weapons most likely to erode the specific defenses of the specific warriors opposing them. Tribune Ra Endymion commanded the Custodian forces inside the Webway for most of this campaign, after the other two commanding tribunes were killed. There were 3 tribunes at the start. 1 survived. The Custodians were reduced, over the years of this campaign, from their full fighting strength to approximately 10% of their original number. The Sisters of Silence, whose Null Maiden abilities were the most effective weapon available against psychic entities, suffered severely alongside them. They fought with no respite, with no relief, with no possibility of retreat, because retreat meant surrendering the gateway and allowing the demon tide to pour through into the depths of the Imperial Palace and up into the city above it, and eventually out into a terror that had no remaining capacity to to stop what was coming. So they held, for years, through losses that would have broken most military institutions past the point of meaningful function, past the point where any accounting of resources would have justified continued resistance. They held because there was nobody else, because the Emperor was occupied, because the war on the surface was consuming every other resource the Imperium possessed. Because if they stopped holding, everything else was irrelevant. They held because that is what they were made to do. When the Webway campaign finally reached its terrible conclusion, when the forces inside were eventually reinforced, when the unspoken sanction was completed on Terra, and the survivors were able to pull back to defensible positions, the warriors who emerged from that experience were not the same as those who had entered it. They carried what they had seen and done in a place that defied description, against enemies that defied the categories of normal understanding, at a cost that had reduced their numbers to something that would take decades to recover from even under ideal conditions. And the ideal conditions were not available because they emerged from the Webway to find the Siege of Terra underway. The siege is better documented than the Webway War, because the siege happened in a place that many people could see and did see and subsequently wrote about. It lasted months. Horus's forces were vast beyond any previous military engagement in the Imperium's history. Entire legions that had turned against the Emperor, supported by armies of mortals who had been corrupted or coerced into service, backed by a fleet that blotted out the stars over Terra. Against them, the defenders of the palace, whatever legions had remained loyal and could be reached, and the Custodians. The Custodians fought with everything they had. After years of the Webway campaign, had already taken 90% of their brothers and sisters. They held walls and cleared corridors and engaged traitor space marines in close combat and performed every function that their extraordinary capabilities were designed to perform. They did not falter. They did not retreat beyond what tactical necessity required. They fought through situations that would have ended most military forces, and they kept functioning. And Constantine Valdor fought his way through the interior of Horus's battle barge, the Vengeful Spirit, with those who had teleported across, killing his way through demon and traitor marine alike, driven by the single imperative to reach the Emperor before it was too late. He was too late. He found the Emperor broken. He found Horus dead. He found the conclusion of everything the heresy had been building toward, the specific outcome that the entire order had existed to prevent. Yet the failure that was both absolute and technically not their fault. The Emperor had made his own choice to board the Vengeful Spirit, had overruled any possibility of custodian protection in that final confrontation, had accepted that the cost of the victory he needed to achieve was something only he could pay. The accounts describe Valdor weeping, a being of such extraordinary self-containment who had navigated the entire history of the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade, and the opening years of the heresy without visible emotional breakdown, weeping at the sight of what had been done to his lord. It is possibly the most human thing the histories record about him. It is certainly the most honest. They carried the Emperor back, they placed him on the Golden Throne, and they put on black cloaks. And before we leave this heresy period entirely, it is worth dwelling on one more figure who carries the weight of this era in a way that connects the past to the uncertain future of the 41st millennium in ways that the lore has only begun to make explicit. Constantine Valdor disappeared, not in battle, not in any documented engagement where his death might have been recorded alongside the deaths of the warriors who fell beside him. He disappeared quietly, in the period following the heresy, when the surviving Primarchs were conducting the Great Scouring, and the Imperium was rebuilding its shattered structure into something that could function without its original architect at the helm. The records show him active, still serving, still attending to the work of the moment, and then they simply stop. During the dead of night, by one account, as he slipped out of the Imperial Palace, paused to look back at it, and was heard to whisper only in death, the first half of the Imperial maxim, only in death does duty end, before vanishing into the galaxy. His weapons and armor never appeared in the Hall of Names. Whatever he carried into that last night, he took with him. The full implication of this has been building in the lore for years, and it connects to characters and storylines in the wider 41st Millennium narrative that are still being developed. What we can worked is that the man who was the Emperor's right hand from the Unification Wars through the end of the heresy, who accumulated nearly 2,000 names in service, who wept at the Emperor's broken form, also who helped carry him back to Terra, chose an ending to his service that remains unexplained and that the custodians who came after him have never been able to account for. His full name, by the 41st Millennium, filled an entire book. That book exists somewhere. What it contains is a story of service so long and so comprehensive that it stretches from the earliest days of human civilization's attempt at unity all the way to its near destruction and beyond. The red that had been the custodians' colour through the crusade, the proud, assertive crimson of warriors who served a living God who walked among them, was packed away. Black was put on in its place. The colour of mourning so deep it requires a change in how you present yourself to the world. Because the world had changed, and the custodians had changed with it, and the change needed to be visible. Some accounts, and this is older lore that was later modified, but it speaks to something real about the psychology of the order, describe certain custodians stripping off their armour entirely and standing vigil over the golden throne in nothing but their helmets and cloaks, their golden plate left to one side as a symbol of the glory they felt they had forfeited and could not yet reclaim. This detail, whether literally accurate to the specific practice or not, captures something true about how the failure of the heresy settled onto the custodians. They did not blame themselves for the Emperor's choice, because it was his choice to make, and they understood that. But they blamed themselves for not being able to find another way, for not having seen the threat early enough, but for not having been the warriors who could have prevented it even against the Emperor's own decisions. Whether that guilt was justified or not is a discussion that the custodians themselves have probably had more times than there are records of. The outcome was the same regardless. They stayed, they watched, they maintained the vigil over the most important life in the Imperium, in silence, in black, for 10,000 years. Section 8. 10,000 years of grief. The long vigil is stopped for a moment and try to genuinely sit with that number, not to absorb it intellectually. The intellectual understanding is easy enough, and we have all encountered very large numbers before, but to feel it, 10,000 years, that is approximately 660 human generations from grandparent to grandchild. It is nearly 4 times longer than all of recorded human history, from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the year you are reading or listening to this. It is a span of time in which empires that lasted 1,000 years could have risen and fallen 10 times, in which languages are born, flourish for centuries, and die leaving only fragments, in which the physical geography of a world can be substantially altered by erosion and geological change, in which everything that defines a civilization can turn over completely, multiple times. The custodians spent 10,000 years standing over the wreckage of their purpose, not doing nothing. The palace still required defending, and they defended it. With heretic cults that burrowed into the understructure of Terra, the vast hive city that had grown up around and beneath and through the palace complex, housing billions of people who had no knowledge that the Golden Warriors existed, were identified and eliminated before they could develop into genuine threats. Political crises that could destabilize the imperial government required the custodians' unique authority to resolve. The occasional catastrophic reality breach demanded an immediate and overwhelming response. The Age of Apostasy is the best documented example of active custodian intervention during the Vigil period. A man named Goje Van Dyer had seized control of the ecclesiarchy, the institutional church of the imperial cult, the largest organized religious structure in human history, and was ruling through a combination of genuine fanaticism and calculated cruelty that the historical record describes as one of the worst periods in post-heresy imperial governance. The custodians, after years of carefully monitoring the deteriorating situation, eventually moved. A contingent penetrated Van Dyer's fortified position. They reached the armed warriors who served as his personal guard. the brides of the emperor, women who would eventually become the foundational order of the Adeptus sororitas, and persuaded their leader, Alicia Dominica, to return with them. What happened when Dominica stood before the golden throne is not recorded. What is recorded is that she emerged changed, and that she and her warriors turned on Vandire, and that his reign ended. But this intervention was exceptional. The defining character of the 10,000-year vigil was not action. It was the absence of action, the systematic confinement of 10,000 of the most powerful warriors in human history to one location for reasons that made complete sense. The emperor must be guarded, and these are his guards. But that accumulated across the centuries into something that the law describes, with careful understatement, as a form of psychological weight. What does it do to a warrior to spend a century standing watch over a person who cannot acknowledge them? To spend a millennium, 10 millennia? The custodians are not simply very capable soldiers. They were made to be companions to a specific being, which are built with the intelligence and the sensitivity and the philosophical depth to function as genuine companions to someone of the emperor's magnitude. That relationship, the full, active, mutual relationship between a custodian and the emperor they were designed to serve, was the context for which they were made, and it was gone. The emperor was present physically, but the presence that had given the relationship its meaning, the awareness and communication and genuine connection that the custodians had been built to experience, and that they had experienced during the crusade, that was absent. What fills that absence across 10,000 years? The law suggests, through accounts spread across multiple sources, that the answer is complex and varies across individuals. And some custodians appear to have found a form of stability in the pure continuity of the vigil itself, in the fact that the watch had been maintained, that the palace had never been breached, that the emperor's physical form was intact, and that this represented a successful fulfillment of purpose, even in the absence of the relationship that had originally animated it. These warriors found meaning in the completeness of the record, rather than in the warmth of the connection. Others, and the accounts of these warriors are harder to read, did not find that stability. The loss was too specific, too personal, too comprehensively addressed to the exact needs and capacities the transformation had produced. Or just the descriptions of certain custodians during the vigil period carry undertones of a grief that was not melodramatic, but quiet and pervasive, and present in every choice and every action across centuries of existence. Some eventually walked to the Hall of Names and left their armor there, and put on a black cloak and went out into the galaxy. The eyes of the Emperor, the tradition of retired custodians moving through the wider Imperium as anonymous operatives, maintaining a watch in a different mode, because the mode they had been assigned was no longer something they could sustain, represents the Order's honest acknowledgement that the vigil had costs, and that warriors who had given everything they could to it had earned the right to give what remained in a different way. The Hall of Names itself deserves a moment of attention, and it is an enormous space within the Imperial Palace, and what it contains is not weapons or trophies or battle honors in the conventional sense. It contains armor, suit after suit after suit of individual, irreplaceable custodian armor, each one unique to the warrior who wore it, each one carrying in its inscriptions and gem arrangements and the specific wear patterns of centuries of service, the complete record of a life that will not come again. Each warrior who bequeathed their armor to the collection was, in the most direct sense, making a gift of their history to the institution. They were saying, "I was here. This is what I did. It mattered. And now I'm going." But the record remains. The hall is not a museum, though it functions as one in certain respects. It is not a memorial in the way that a battlefield monument is a memorial, as it is something closer to a library, a physical archive of individual lives that the Order has decided must be preserved even after the lives themselves have ended, because the knowledge of who these people were and what they contributed is part of the institution's understanding of itself. A custodian walking through the Hall of Names and reading the inscriptions on the suits that line its walls is reading the actual history of the Order, not a summary or an interpretation, but the primary source, the record as each warrior chose to inscribe it in the language and emphasis and selection of events that reflected their own understanding of what had mattered in their service. Some suits in the hall are ancient beyond the easy reckoning of years. Their inscriptions are dense beyond the ability of the longest viewing to fully absorb, as the text worked in between earlier text in the available space with a precision that suggests the artisans who did the later additions were operating at the absolute limit of what their tools and skills could achieve. These suits belong to warriors who served from the earliest years of the Custodian Guard and eventually chose the hall, not because they could no longer fight, but because they had reached some internal threshold, some point at which the continued investment of their specific presence in the active roster was no longer the most valuable use of what they had left to give, and the transition to a different form of service became the right choice. What makes this tradition significant is that it is entirely voluntary. No custodian is forced into retirement. No one is assessed and found wanting and removed from active duty against their will. The judgment of when the time has come rests entirely with the individual warrior, because the entire institutional culture of the custodians is built on the premise that individual judgment is what makes them what they are, and undermining that judgment in any circumstance would undermine everything the order is designed to be. The blood games during this period were sustained through extraordinary means. The specialized corps dispatched to recover dangerous subjects from the wider galaxy, Chaos Space Marines, powerful mutants, other categories of genuinely lethal non-custodian warrior, was taking real risks in its retrieval operations. Is operating far beyond the solar system in defiance of the Edict of Restraint that theoretically confined all custodians to terror. Whether this constituted a technical violation of that edict or was covered under some provision for operational necessity is a question the custodians themselves probably did not worry about, because the Edict of Restraint was an oath they had sworn to themselves and the Emperor, and they knew what it was for, and the blood games were serving that same purpose. The psychological insight embedded in this practice, bringing the galaxy's worst inside the walls to test against them, is accepting the genuine risk of casualties in a controlled environment specifically because the controlled environment was the only way to produce real test conditions, reflects something consistent about how the custodians approached every aspect of their work. They did not allow themselves the comfort of believing they were ready if they had no evidence for it. They demanded evidence. They created conditions to generate evidence. They accepted the costs that evidence required. This is what 10,000 years of waiting looked like in practice. Not stagnation, but a form of constant, sustained readiness maintenance in the face of circumstances that made genuine testing difficult. Not passive endurance, but active investment in the quality of the vigil they had sworn. And when things eventually changed, when the events of the 41st millennium began producing outcomes that the vigil had been waiting for, the custodians who emerged from that 10,000-year preparation found themselves ready in ways that perhaps only the quality of that preparation can explain. Section 9. The Golden Return. A new era of war, the circumstances that finally broke the long vigil open, accumulated over the course of decades, each one individually significant, and together producing something that no single person in the Imperium had planned or could have fully anticipated. Cadia fell, the 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon the Despoiler's final supreme campaign, as the culmination of 10,000 years of patient empire building in the service of the Chaos Gods, overwhelmed the fortress world that had stood against Chaos's advance for 10 millennia. And in falling, Cadia triggered the creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a tear in the fabric of reality so vast that it split the Imperium in two along an irregular line from the galactic north to the south. The half cut off from Terra, the Imperium Nihilus, found itself in darkness in the most literal sense, the Astronomican's light no longer reliably reaching across the rift, the navigational guidance that had been the foundation of interstellar travel for 10,000 years, suddenly absent for half the human population of the galaxy. In the midst of this is through a series of events that combined Belisarius Caul's 10,000-year biological research project, the Eldari's desperate fulfillment of ancient prophecy, and the pure determined will of Ultramarines fighters who refused to let their Primarch's journey end. Rabuta Guilliman came back to life, the first Primarch to return, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the Emperor's Regent, the man who had organized the Imperium's government during the time of rebirth after the heresy, and whose principles had governed it, more or less, ever since. He fought his way back to Terra through chaos forces that understood exactly what his return implied, and threw everything they could reach at preventing it. He did not stop. He moved with the urgency of a being who had been effectively dead for 10,000 years, and had woken up to find that the galaxy was worse than he had feared, and that there was no time to waste on disorientation. On Terra, before he could enter the Emperor's throne room for the meeting that both he and everyone observing the situation understood would be decisive, he had to get past the Custodians. Trajan Valoris, the 17th Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, by contemporary assessment the single deadliest individual warrior in the entire Imperium, a being who had fought his way to this position through deeds that included 2 successful blood games, a record never equaled, the destruction of a space hulk, and the defeat of a Genestealer cult of significant power, stood at the threshold of the Emperor's presence and assessed the Primarch who was requesting passage. What passed between them in that meeting is not documented in full. What is documented is that Guilliman was permitted to enter the throne room. He spent an entire day alone with the Emperor. When he emerged, his face carried something that those who saw it struggled to describe. Not grief, exactly, not rage, though both might have been justified, but a determination so complete it had become indistinguishable from serenity. Behind closed doors, with a security arrangement that would have detected any monitoring, Guilliman and Valoris reached an agreement. The edict of restraint that had confined the Custodians to the solar system for 10,000 years was formally amended. What the companions would remain at the Golden Throne, the palace would still be guarded, but the rest of the 10,000 would go out. They would take the fight to the Emperor's enemies across the galaxy, operating at the sharp end of the Indomitus Crusade, serving as the living proof that the Emperor still had will and intention and the capacity for directed response. This shift had been building in Valoris's preparations for years before the formal amendment made it possible. He had been preparing for this. The intensification of blood games tripled in frequency under his leadership, the purge of hidden cults in the Terran underhives, the launch of 32 documented extrasolar interdiction strikes against identified threats, the strengthening of the Sol System's stable warp route defenses. All of it reads, in retrospect, Oj as a commander preparing his forces for a sustained operational tempo that the vigil period had not required. Whether Valoris had genuinely anticipated Guilliman's return through the moment shackle, a mysterious personal artifact whose properties include what is described as a capacity for temporal intuition, or had simply made the correct strategic assessment that something was coming, and the Custodians needed to be ready for it, regardless of its specific form, the result was the same. When the time came, they were ready. The Second Battle of Terra demonstrated this readiness under conditions that left no room for uncertainty. When Cornate demons tore through reality at the Lion's Gate and advanced on the Imperial Palace in a tide that the defensive systems could not contain alone, Valoris did not wait behind the walls. He led 4,000 Custodians out through the gate in a charge, the most concentrated deployment of the Order's combat strength since the Siege of Terra 10,000 years before, and they met the demon tide in open battle in the streets before the palace. Half of them died. 2,000 Custodians killed in a single engagement, 2,000 unique, irreplaceable warriors representing thousands of years of accumulated experience and service, an irreproducible genetic investment, gone in a battle that lasted hours. The Custodians who survived formed back up and continued the fight until it was won, in conjunction with Guilliman's forces and the Sisters of Silence, and then they went back inside and maintained their vigil and reported their losses and did what needed to be done next. The bell rang 2,000 times. The era that followed has seen Custodians spread across the galaxy in numbers and configurations that would have been unimaginable during the Vigil period. Shield hosts operating deep in the Imperium Nihilus, beyond the Rift, in regions where ordinary navigational methods fail, and where the warp is so unstable that even astropathic communication is unreliable. Some of these forces use fragments of the webway to reach their destinations, a fact that quietly acknowledges the ongoing relevance of the Emperor's original project, the one that was shattered before the heresy and has been maintained in fragmentary form ever since. Individual operatives pursuing targets of specific strategic importance to the Emperor's safety, and targets that might not appear on any conventional threat assessment, but which the oracular intelligence available to the custodians indicates must be dealt with before they become something larger. Valoris himself has operated at the political level, taking a seat among the High Lords of Terror, an appointment that the Captain General historically took only under the most dire circumstances, and using that seat to actively shape Imperial policy in ways that serve the mission. His influence was decisive in the crisis that followed Guilliman's return, when certain High Lords were maneuvering in ways that would have created new obstacles to the Primarch's ability to govern effectively. Valoris's presence at the table, and the subtle exercise of the authority that the presence of the Emperor's representative carries, has quieted that maneuvering in ways that did not require explicit threat or open confrontation. The crimson robes went back on. The black cloaks were put away. The mourning did not end. It cannot end. Not really, not while the Emperor remains on the throne. But it found a new expression. Not silent grief, but active expenditure. The 10,000 years of preparation, paying out into 10,000 years, or however many remain, of service. They are back. The galaxy is complicated by this fact in ways it is still processing. Section 10. The burden of perfection. What it truly costs. There is a quote attributed to the Emperor himself, preserved in obscure corners of the Custodian archive, that speaks directly to what he understood about what he was creating and what he was asking of them. What he is recorded as having said to his custodians: "We were never soldiers. To them, it must seem as if we are wrath incarnate. To them, it must seem as if we were created for destruction and nothing else. But we were his companions once. We were the ones in whom he confided. We were his counselors. We were his artisans. We were the first glimpse at what the species could become." This matters because it clarifies what the custodians actually are. Beneath and beyond all the extraordinary combat capability, they were made to be a relationship. They were made to be present with someone, to be the people around whom that someone moved and thought and chose. They were made to be companions to the Emperor in a way that is not merely metaphorical. The word carries its full weight here. And when the Emperor fell, what they lost was not just their purpose in the narrow, functional sense, but the entirety of what they had been made for in the deepest sense. Consider what it means to be a custodian in the 41st millennium, sitting with everything this history implies. You do not age in any meaningful sense. You carry in your enhanced memory a complete, vivid, fully contextualized record of everything you have experienced across whatever centuries your service has lasted. For the oldest custodians, those who were active during the Great Crusade, that memory encompasses watching the Emperor walk among humanity in his full power, hearing his voice in real-time dialogue rather than through the silence of the throne, feeling the specific quality of being known and valued by the most powerful conscious being in the history of the species, as they carry this with the same fidelity as they carry the memory of what came after: the Webway War, the Siege, the Fall, the Black Cloaks, and 10,000 years of silence. There is no forgetting. There is no softening of the edges that the passage of time normally provides to human memory. A custodian who was present at the Siege of Terror has not developed, over 10,000 years, any increased psychological distance from that experience. The wounds are as immediate as they were when they were made, in the sense that the memory is as clear and as present as it was the morning after. The experience of sustained combat trauma that human psychology describes as PTSD and that Space Marine training partially addresses through conditioning, that experience for a custodian is not managed by time. It is managed by continued service, was by the ongoing investment of attention and energy into the mission, by the daily choice to take the next step forward rather than standing still in the memory of what was lost. This is not easy. The law does not pretend it is easy. What it suggests, through the accumulated weight of accounts from various periods, is that the custodians have developed a relationship with difficulty that is neither stoic denial nor performative suffering, but something more like honest acknowledgement in service of continued action. They know what they carry, they know what it costs. They choose to carry it anyway, because the alternative is to put it down, and putting it down means leaving the watch, and leaving the watch is something they will not do. Was the philosophical education that is built into their training takes on a different quality when you understand this context. It is not merely a supplement to their combat effectiveness. It is the structure through which they process 10,000 years of history without being destroyed by it. The capacity to examine a situation from outside the frame of one's own emotional investment, to see what is actually present rather than what grief and loss would have one see. To identify the difference between what has been lost and what remains. These are not abstract intellectual skills. They are survival tools for beings who must continue to function under conditions that would break most minds. The relationship between custodians and the Adeptus Astartes in the present era is interesting precisely because of this. Space Marines respect the custodians in the way that any honest assessment of comparative capability forces. But the respect is complicated by something that Space Marines, with their orientation toward brotherhood and collective identity, struggle to fully understand. The custodians' relationship with their own mortality, with their own uniqueness, with the specific and irreproducible nature of each individual life the Order contains. The relationship between custodians and the Adeptus Astartes in the present era is interesting precisely because of this. Space Marines respect the custodians in the way that any honest assessment of comparative capability forces, but the respect is complicated by something that Space Marines, with their orientation toward brotherhood and collective identity, should struggle to fully understand. The custodians' relationship with their own mortality, with their own uniqueness, with the specific and irreproducible nature of each individual life the Order contains. A Space Marine who falls in battle is a loss, and that loss is mourned, and then another recruit is brought into the chapter, and the process of making a new Space Marine begins. The chapter continues, the tradition continues, the gene seed is recovered, and the line continues. There is grief, but there is also continuity, and the continuity of the institution carries the grief through time until it becomes part of the tradition rather than a wound in it. When a custodian dies, that is it. That specific combination of genetic lore and individual history and centuries of lived experience and the specific knowledge of a specific person who has been in specific places and done specific things, gone. Not replaceable, not replicable, not recoverable through any process the Imperium has available. The bell rings. The armor goes to the Hall of Names. And the knowledge that the armor contains, not the inscriptions, which record the facts, but the living knowledge that the warrior carried in memory and judgment, and the accumulated capacity of a life intensively lived. That knowledge goes with them, and it cannot be recovered. This is the source of the phrase that has been attributed to the Emperor in relation to his custodians. I am miserly with your lives. Wish where I would spend so many others without a thought. It reflects his understanding of what each custodian represents, not a unit of military capability that can be replaced, but an irreplaceable individual investment that the Imperium literally cannot afford to lose without awareness. The custodians carry this knowledge about themselves too. They know what they are worth. They know that their deaths are, in a specific material sense, more costly to the Imperium than the deaths of almost anyone else. And they spend their lives in service anyway, because the cost of not spending them would be higher. There is also something worth noting about how the custodians relate to the wider Imperium's mythology about them, the Imperium's popular culture, and to the extent that such a thing can be said to exist across a trillion-world civilization. with minimal, reliable communication between its members, tends to treat the custodians as mythological beings, as something between angels and golems, divine instruments that exist outside the normal categories of human experience. This is understandable, given how rarely they are seen and how overwhelming the impression they make when they are encountered. But it is also a form of distance that the custodians themselves maintain a complicated relationship with. On one hand, the mythological status serves the mission, a warrior whose mere presence changes the calculus of a room, who inspires awe and fear in measures that make threats recalculate their plans before taking action. That is a more effective guardian than one who is viewed as merely formidable. The reputation does genuine protective work. On the other hand, being treated as a myth is a form of isolation from the humanity the custodians exist to protect. It creates a gap between what they are and what the people they guard understand them to be. And that gap makes the relationship between guardian and guarded less honest than it should be. The blood games, again, serve to close that gap on the custodian's side of it, to return the warrior to the reality of ordinary human experience, at least temporarily, at least partially. But the ordinary humans who are guarded do not get an equivalent experience. They will live and die never having known what a custodian actually is, and the custodians will watch them do it and protect them through it, and carry the knowledge of the full story in ways that the people being protected can never share. This is one of the specific solitudes of the custodian's existence, and it is one that their philosophical training addresses directly. The training does not resolve it. It cannot be resolved because it is structural rather than contingent, built into the relationship between what the custodians are and what ordinary humans are. But it teaches them to hold the solitude without being diminished by it, to understand it as the price of the specific service they perform, and to accept that price as part of what was agreed to when the oaths were made and the armor was accepted and the name was taken and the watch began. The watch began a very long time ago. It continues. And the people who perform it carry everything described in this video into each new day of it and make the choice each day to carry it further. That is the life of an Adeptus Custodes, not a half-life, not a lesser existence than what they might have been without the transformation and the oaths and the 10,000 years of history. A full life, with full weight, fully inhabited. The life of someone who chose something enormous and has been equal to that choice across every test that the universe has been able to put to them. The blood games serve a psychological function alongside their obvious security function, and it is worth naming explicitly. When a custodian spends a year moving through the underhives of terror in disguise, navigating the reality of ordinary human existence from inside it rather than above it, they are reminded of what they are protecting. Not the institution, not the formal structure of the Imperium, not the abstract principle of human continuity. The people, the billions and billions of ordinary human beings who go about their complicated, difficult, short lives within the elaborate structure that the Imperium provides them, and who depend, without knowing it, on the continued effectiveness of warriors they will never see and would not recognize if they passed them on the street. This reminder is not incidental. The risk with any highly specialized institution that operates in isolation from the population it serves is institutional drift, the slow, almost imperceptible process by which the institution comes to serve itself, was to optimize for its own continuity, to treat the external mission as a justification for its existence rather than the other way around. The custodians have not been immune to this risk across 10,000 years, but they have built in mechanisms to resist it. The blood games, the eyes of the emperor tradition, the philosophical education that asks each custodian at every stage of their development to examine their relationship with their own purpose and to identify any drift between what they are doing and why they should be doing it. A custodian who has been moving through the underhives of terror, buying cheap food from vendors who have no idea who they are talking to, navigating the petty cruelties and small kindnesses that characterize life in the lower city, was watching what ordinary humans do with their brief lives and what they hope for and what they fear, that custodian goes back to the palace with something renewed, something that the gilded corridors and the ritual observances and the formal structures of the order do not produce on their own. They go back knowing why the vigil matters, not as an abstraction, but as a felt reality, grounded in specific people and specific faces and specific moments of ordinary humanity that the custodian's extraordinary existence does not normally bring them into contact with. This is the life of an Adeptus Custodes in its totality, not just the armor and the weapons and the combat record that makes other warriors stop and stare, the full span of it, the making, the training, the walking beside a living god, the catastrophe, the grief, as the 10,000 years of silence, the choice to remain, the return, and the ongoing negotiation between what was lost and what remains, and what must be done with what remains. It is not a simple life. It is one of the most complex and most demanding existences that the Warhammer 40,000 universe has produced. And the custodians carry it with a quality of presence that is ultimately their most remarkable characteristic. They chose this. Every day they choose this. Not because they have to, not because they are incapable of choosing otherwise, but because they understand what it means and what it is worth, and they choose it anyway. That is what it means to be one of the Emperor's own. Section 11. The Eternal Watch, what they carry into tomorrow. There is a bell on Terra, as it has been ringing since before the Imperium had its current name, since before the formal institutions of human government had been rebuilt from the Age of Strife's wreckage, since before the first Space Marine was created and the first Primarch was found. It rang when the Emperor's work first required it, and it has continued to ring down through 10,000 years of history, its deep, rolling note carrying through the walls of the palace and into the streets of the vast hive city outside, and into the mythology of a civilization that, even in its most secularized or most heretical corners, tends to go quiet when it hears the bell of lost souls. It rang rarely during the long vigil, and in those 10,000 years when the custodians almost never left the palace, and the most dangerous enemies they faced were the ones they brought inside for blood games. A death among the 10,000 was an extraordinary event, and the bell sounding was correspondingly rare. The sound of it, when it did come, stopped everything. It rings more often now. The Second Battle of Terror alone rang it to 2,000 times in a single day. The campaigns that followed, shield hosts operating in the Imperium Nihilus, custodians fighting on worlds where the stars are wrong and the rules of reality have been suspended by proximity to the Great Rift, lone operatives in black cloaks encountering things in the dark that even their extraordinary capabilities could not guarantee survival from, have kept the bell busy in a way that the vigil period never did. And after each ringing, the remaining custodians continue. They form back up. They complete the mission, or they begin the next mission, or they return to the palace, and they put on their armor, and they stand their watch. Because that is what they are. Because that is what they chose to be. And the choice was made with full knowledge of what it would cost, and nothing that has happened since has been sufficient to make them regret it. In the throne room of the Imperial Palace, 300 of the most experienced warriors in human history stand in silence around the golden throne. Each one has served for at least 5 centuries, and each one carries in their memory a complete, vivid record of everything they have seen and done and lost across those 5 centuries. Each one is standing in the specific proximity to the Emperor's presence that was the original design purpose for everything their existence has ever contained, and the Emperor is silent and has been silent for 10,000 years, and they are still here. What the Golden Throne actually is, and what the Emperor actually is within it, is one of the great uncertainties of the 41st millennium's theology and politics. The most honest answer available is that nobody fully knows. The Mechanicus maintains the physical systems of the throne with the devotion of a religion directed at a machine, following procedures that were established in the aftermath of the heresy and have not changed because nobody has dared to authorize a change. The Adeptus Astronomica sits in its prescribed location and feeds the Astronomicon with the psychic energy of thousands of individuals whose lives are burned up in the process, providing the navigational light that makes interstellar travel possible, which means the Emperor's psychic presence is still doing work, is still in some form present and functional. But whether he is conscious in a way that would be recognizable as consciousness by any conventional definition, whether he experiences anything at all within the ruined body that sits on the throne, and whether the devotion being directed at him by billions of worshippers produces something that could be called response. These are questions that the custodians live with daily and cannot fully answer. Some of the companions who have served longest at the throne describe, in the rare conversations that they have with other members of the Order about this subject, a quality of presence that is not merely the physical fact of the Emperor's body, something that extends outward from the throne and is perceptible to enhanced senses in ways that basic monitoring equipment does not capture. Whether this is the Emperor's continued awareness reaching outward from the mechanism that contains him, or the accumulated psychic resonance of 10,000 years of faith directed at this location, is or some quality of the auramite and the mechanical systems and the specific geometry of the space around the throne that produces a measurable effect without implying conscious origin. None of them can say with certainty, but they stay. They stand their watch around whatever is present at that throne, because it is the Emperor's form, and their oaths were made to the Emperor's form, and the fact that the nature of his current existence is uncertain does not release them from those oaths. If anything, the uncertainty makes the vigil more important, not less. In the absence of certainty about what he can do for himself, the certainty of what they will do for him becomes the only thing available. This is not a tragedy, though it contains tragedy. This is not a story of failure, though it contains failure. This is the story of what it means to remain loyal to something beyond the point where loyalty is comfortable or convenient or personally rewarding. What it means to serve, not because the service is recognized or reciprocated or even witnessed, but because the thing being served is worth the service, regardless of what the service costs. The Adeptus Custodes are not the most understood warriors in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They are not the most celebrated in the way that Space Marine chapters accumulate the kind of devotional following that generates battle cries and founding myths, and the vivid personal stories of brothers fighting together and dying together and carrying each other's memory forward. The custodians are more solitary than that, more individual, and their story is quieter in a specific way, not because what they have done is less significant, but because the significance operates at a different register, in a mode that requires more patience from an audience than the immediate, visceral satisfaction of a great battle charge. But that story, the full story, from the infants presented before the Ascensor's Gate to the Golden Warriors now moving through the Imperium Nihilus under alien stars, is one of the most genuinely moving things the Warhammer 40,000 universe has produced. It is about time and love, and the specific catastrophe of losing the thing that gave your existence its meaning, and choosing to continue existing in the shadow of that loss, and finding in the continuation itself a form of meaning that is different from the original but not lesser. Quote, they were made to be companions to a god. The god is silent. They are still here. That is the life of an Adeptus Custodes. If you stayed with me through all of that, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is the kind of lore that deserves to be explored at this depth, and I hope you found something in it that surprised you or moved you or gave you a new way of thinking about these extraordinary warriors. The Adeptus Custodes are so much more than a tabletop faction with impressive stats. They are one of the most thematically rich and genuinely emotionally resonant elements of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and the more deeply you look at what they actually are and what they have actually been through, the more you understand why the image of golden warriors standing in silence around a broken god has endured for 10,000 years of in-universe history, and for the real decades in which this setting has been written and painted and fought over and loved. If this video added something to your understanding of them, please consider leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel reach the people who would value this kind of deep, unhurried exploration of the lore. And if you want more videos like this, exploring the people and tragedies and moments of genuine beauty that live in the darkness of the 41st millennium, subscribe and make sure the notification bell is on. The watch continues. We will be here when you come back.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.